If one were to start a history of modern popular radio, of course you would mention Marconi, Braun, and even Fessenden. And from there we're going to look at how it spread and became regulated and popular and maybe even facing its demise. Commercial radio is really a subset of a whole host of radio frequencies which take form in various ways. Probably the most notable change most people might recall was the change to digital TV some dozen years ago. And of course there's allocations for police, aviation, a whole bunch of others. In 1912, the Department of Commerce began some regulations of what had been a very confusing conflict in terms of frequency, power. In 1927, the Federal Radio Commission began a more formal process. And by 1934, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, came into effect, bringing some real order to what had been a chaotic situation, particularly in terms of stations conflicting with each other, so both were impossible to listen to. You would many times find the set would actually have the stations on the receiver itself, and the development of networks began to occur. It was Robert Sarnoff of the National Broadcasting Company who coined the term broadcasting, to cast broadly, as it were, from the agricultural term when you would cast seed generally about. This was a very changed idea from the original concept of point-to-point radio broadcasting. In the transition from experimental stations with experimental call letters, often with numbers, they went to fully licensed commercial operations. First major station, KDKA Pittsburgh.
1020 KDKA Pittsburgh.
Many know that you have generally K's in the west, W's in the east, kind of a boundary line along the Mississippi River, with a lot of notable exceptions. Back then, the programming was not unlike, say, television is today, at least among the networks, with, of course, no picture. And you had sports, concerts, political speeches. Those were important. Many a drama. Most notable, of course, was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which was on another network, CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. And NBC actually had two networks, the red and the blue, with the blue network eventually becoming ABC, and there was also the Mutual Broadcasting System. There were clear channel 50,000 watt AM stations, typically no more than two on the same frequency if on either coast, or on one frequency if somewhere in the middle part of America. There were typically no more than two per major city, and these were meant for clear reception across the country. Well, with the first commercial on television in 1941, Bull of a Watch Time, by a decade later, radio had really faced a crisis. And there was a guy named Ted Storrs, and he was supposedly at a malt shop and noticed the kids dancing to the jukebox, and he said, "There is a format for radio. Just play records." And sure enough, KOWH in Omaha began Top 40 Radio.
WVGC, your music. VGC. WNVC 66. The best music. WLS. KOMA. WABC, New York City.
And they had something called hot clocks, meaning a format where you had to play certain stuff at a certain time in a certain way, and they had payola scandals and playlists, and, well, then it had to change. Program directors and music directors took control, and then it really changed.
KRLA. KFWB, Channel 98.
And the control went from the DJ to the program director, the music director, and rightly so, or maybe not. And then the changes became even tighter with something called formatics, and then the sound became almost just like that jukebox.
KYNO, Fresno. KTB, San Diego. The Big 610, KFRC. KHJ, Los Angeles.
While at the same time there were urban, predominantly black stations, then called R&B, rhythm and blues.
KDIA, Lucky 13.
50,000 watt. AM stereo, KDAY, Santa Monica, Los Angeles.
KDFJ, the sound of success.
And this wasn't lost on Bob Smith, who went to Del Rio, Texas, and changed it all.
We got to close it out. That's it for the Wolfman Jack Show for tonight.
XETRA FM, Baja California, México.
And something was added to the dial next to those little red triangles, which were for civil defense at 640 and 1240, and thankfully were never used, and that was frequency modulation, FM. It carried the signal by changing the frequency instead of the amplitude, and thus came in clear as a bell, and was a function of altitude instead of power. Boy, what a change it did. At first, middle-of-the-road music, people were afraid. There was album-oriented rock, hippie, low, cool stuff. And then it began.
Here on the radio station you grew up with, Music Radio 138. Oh, fuck. What the hell's going on here?
Just as it deregulated the profits on the medical profession, deregulated air travel, deregulated donations to the political parties, they deregulated radio. No longer were you restricted from having more than one station or a total of 12. You could buy as many as you wanted, and you got Infinity and Clear Channel.
Kiss FM, Los Angeles. Kiss FM. Today's best music, 96.9. Kiss FM.
And that was prompted by a change in technology, whereas computers, and namely something called voice tracking, sometimes called the Prophet system, depending on how you spelled it, meaning one DJ, in the case of iHeartRadio, down in San Antonio, Texas, we could do 3, 4, 5 shows, 4 or 5 hours long, all in maybe just an hour, all recorded, sent up and down by a satellite. And you know, if you do pay attention, it is a certain lost art that it's just no longer spontaneous and real. You've lost your friend.
WPRC. A little better with your friends. A little better with your friends. Hot Rocket C100.
And I say you lose your friend because, well, you know, in a way that's what radio was. You under the covers at night, right up to your ear. But you know, things do change, and it has allowed some stations to stay on the air, given the cost effectiveness of it. As we leave, I'm going to leave you with some of my favorite radio jingles.
CFUN in Vancouver. CKLW, the Motor City. The best music, KCBQ. KCMO, Mid-America.
KFM, BFM, San Diego. Shotgun Tom Kelly in the morning. Good morning, baby. How you feeling?
KFXM, flashback.